seeing in many Commonwealth countries, we see there's one-party rule, and often with the political opposition marginalized, human rights defenders have to stand up and hold the government to account on non-fulfillment of electoral promises, on its governance record. And again, at this time, what happens is that civil society comes in contact with the harsh edge of the state, and we see repressive legislation, we see arrests being carried out, we see motivated prosecutions being carried out. Apart from that, there's other subtle forms of repression that NGOs have to face. For example, repeated requests for information. There's raids, visits to NGOs, statements by government officials saying you are crossing your remit, made in private or made in public, which prevents civil society from carrying out its mandate. Of course, and the freedom of assembly, especially in countries like Singapore and Malaysia, you have internal security acts which require people to take permission from the government before protesting, and this permission rarely ever comes through. And the very fact that this kind of legislation is on the statute books is an affront to the Commonwealth. Why is the Commonwealth not doing anything about it? I mean, one is of course the practice, but before the practice is all of this legislation. In my own country, in India, for example, we have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is in force in some insurgency-affected areas, which allows security forces to actually shoot to kill on a public assembly of 5 or more persons, which is not there without government permission. And so I think it's time that we as civil society in the Commonwealth hold our governments to account, but also hold the Commonwealth to account. The raison d'etre, the Commonwealth exists because of human rights. And if human rights are being so openly and flagrantly being disrespected in the Commonwealth, then, well, maybe it's time for all of us to pack our bags and go home and maybe look at the United Nations, or look at the Inter-American Commission, or let's approach the African Union, or let's approach, other places. I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to be quick. I think another thing also which I want to speak about is a number of Commonwealth countries have been very strong at international forums. The United Kingdom and Australia are 2 countries which have always preached human rights to a number of countries, to a number of other countries. But when you really look at their records at the United Nations, it's amazing to see how politics subsumes the human rights agenda. For example, I was there at the UN Human Rights Council session in September, October, where the Justice Richards Goldstone report on the Gaza conflict was being discussed. Both the UK, and Australia, 2 countries which always say that they stand for human rights and they've always castigated other countries' human rights records, were silent. They didn't do anything. If there is a greater human rights violation, by the state of Israel, the attacks that were carried out on innocent civilians, they were a breach of everything international law stands for. They were an open breach of the Geneva Conventions, where civilians were deliberately targeted. But both of these 2 countries didn't do anything. They were silent. They were, of course, more vocal on Sudan. They have been so vocal on Zimbabwe. But why these double standards? Does that mean do you really care about human rights, or do you care about your politics? And if heads of government, it's time we send a clear message to heads of government that we want the rhetoric to go into action, and we don't want the human rights agenda to be subsumed by political concerns. I think yesterday's discussions were, of course, illuminating in many ways, and I think 3 clear recommendations that came out. If the Commonwealth is serious about human rights, it must expand. It must deepen the mandate of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. They must criticize, and they must hold to account Commonwealth countries in a transparent manner that don't subscribe, that don't follow, that don't practice Commonwealth values. And if these countries do not want to practice Commonwealth values, then they're free to leave the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group must be strong on that. The second was, of course, a complaints mechanism. I think it's time that the Commonwealth thinks about a complaints mechanism where individuals, where NGOs or other interested parties can actually bring a complaint to the Commonwealth Secretariat. that is properly considered, that has clear recommendations to the government concerned that has been abusing human rights. And the third, of course, was a very interesting idea to have something of a periodic review of at the Commonwealth. The United Nations, of course, has the Human Rights Council. There's a periodic review where every country has to account to its human rights record. There's a report by the state, there's a report by the National Human Rights Institution of the country, and there's a report by NGOs. And states answer for are held accountable. They answer for their human rights records, but they also tell other states on what they plan to do to address these issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mandeep. I mean, we should all be a little bit, I think, not a little bit, very concerned about it, and perhaps need to reflect, as Mandeep has, Mary Robinson did last year on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at the way we have gone backwards in human rights observance, legally and institutionally, since 9/11. She too called the last decade the saddest of her career as a human rights defender. I'm now going to invite Hassan Shri Sheikh, who is Director of Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project, to give us the actual experience of human rights related work at national and international levels.
I thank you very much, Madam Chair, and greetings to you and good morning for those of you who have braved the rain. I just want to start brief overview of the challenge of human rights defenders facing at national and regional level. My project works in 10 countries in eastern part of Africa, and the network which I represent also works throughout the continent in member states of African Union. The experience I'm sharing with you is research focus on that part of the world, which by and large also relevant to the context under which human rights defenders are working throughout the continent. Human rights defenders have time and again proven to key actors in the struggle for the promotion, respect, and fulfillment of the civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights. They are a crucial link in the chain of human rights protection, from campaigning on behalf of victims of human rights violation to lobbying at the highest level for improved mechanisms for human rights protection. However, the situation of human rights defenders in a number of countries to date is deteriorating. The challenge faced by HRD to increase, as Mandeep now has just mentioned it. Given the focus on the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Program, on the Eastern Horn region, I will concentrate my presentation, as I said, on these findings. I must point out the elections are scheduled to take place in most of the countries of the region over the course of the next 2 years, and this is already having a negative impact on the human rights